5.7% inflation shoots well past the Chancellor's budget forecast and now stands at its highest level for 2 years. We'll be examining evidence that surging wage demands and other pressures in the economy could drive inflation up still further. And Norman Tebbit will be responding to the opposition's argument that government economic policy is falling apart at the seams. Also tonight, as Hurricane Gilbert heads for Mexico and Texas, we have an on-the-spot report and look at the causes of these devastating storms. Mikhail Gorbachev announces a radical plan to reduce superpower influence in the Pacific. But can it work? And the SDP hits rock bottom in the polls on the eve of its annual conference. Dr. Owen tells Newsnight his party is learning its lessons the hard way. Tonight, inflation has moved back up the political agenda with the cost of living at its highest for almost 3 years. Today's announcement of an inflation rate of 5.7% means an increase of almost 1% on last month. Chancellor Nigel Lawson's policy of putting up interest rates to keep the economy's rapid growth under control has led to rises in turn in the mortgage rate, and that has contributed to pushing prices beyond Mr. Lawson's March forecast of 4% inflation by the end of the year. This afternoon, the Labour leader, Neil Kinnock, said the new figures showed that the government's economic policy is coming apart at the seams. The United Kingdom's upward trend in inflation certainly puts our inflation rate above that of key industrial competitors. Japan has the lowest inflation with just over 0.5%. The Americans have reached 4.1%. Francine Stock now looks at the implications of today's inflation figures for future economic policy.
We had been warned. Inflation, said the Chancellor on Wednesday, would show a significant increase. But today's rise in the retail price index to an annual 5.7% took inflation to its highest since December 1985. And it appeared to support forecasts of up to 7% by the end of the year. The opposition leapt on the news.
These are disturbing figures, and I think they're further proof of government economic mismanagement. Quite clearly, we've now got a rising inflation problem added to the already serious balance of payments position. And of course, these increases have been largely caused by the government themselves. The mortgage increases as a result of interest rate hikes caused by the Chancellor and public sector price increases running at twice the rate of inflation.
Mr. Lawson, could I have a brief comment on the inflation figures, please?
The Chancellor dodged the inquest. He had to leave for a finance minister's meeting in Crete, so it was left to a junior Treasury Minister to maintain that today's figure was indeed what Mr. Lawson would call just a temporary blip.
It's important to recognise that the increase this month over last month is entirely due to the rise in mortgage rates. If they're stripped out, then the rate of increase in underlying prices would have been 5%, the same as the previous month.
The RPI has risen from 3.3% at the beginning of the year to 5.7% in August. But without mortgage interest, the retail price index begins the year at 3.7% when mortgage rates were low, and rises steadily to reach 5% in July and August.
I think at the moment it's an embarrassment rather than a really serious economic problem. But we are going to see in the next few months inflation rising to perhaps 6.5%, 7%. And I think unless the government can persuade and convince people not to take that as an excuse to increase their wage demands, then what we could see the beginnings of a very serious economic problem.
Wage costs are an unpredictable element. Figures released yesterday show average earnings, wages plus overtime and bonuses, were up 9% on the year. But higher productivity compensates for much of that increase. A study to be published on Monday, however, indicates that wage demands will become more ambitious.
Over the past 3 years, pay settlements have been reasonably stable, centring between about 5% and 6.5%. But we've recently conducted some investigations amongst key negotiators across a variety of industrial and service sector groups. And our findings are that next year people will be settling generally higher than they are settling this year.
Those wage demands will be received by management in industry that is profitable and productive. Against that atmosphere of prosperity, what are the pressures on labour rates?
One, obviously, the actual published current rate of inflation does have some importance, especially, I think, at the lower end of the wage increases, because it almost sets a sort of a minimum, which is very difficult for many employers to offer a smaller increase. unless they obviously have acute financial problems. Well, the other thing which is important is obviously the demand for labour. And we've seen in the last year that employment in the service industries has risen by about 400,000 people. That obviously is concentrated more in the southern half of the country. And this is just to be seen in how the unemployment rate has fallen, and therefore how there is an increasing demand for labour. And in those circumstances, it's very difficult for many employers not to offer larger increases, or perhaps in the form of higher allowances for those working in and around London.
The Chancellor said this week that the growth in earnings clearly needs to slow down. It's not so clear how that will be achieved.
Well, this government has always made it very clear that it won't have an incomes policy, and I don't think we'll see any change in that. I think what we'll see is an even tighter squeeze in terms of interest rates. I think there's an expectation in the city anyway that the government may have to raise interest rates again during the autumn. I think if wages start moving up, that will become a certainty.
As inflation appears to continue its upward trend, then over the next few weeks in Whitehall and the city, the outcome of wage negotiations will once more move up the political agenda.
Well, Mr. Tebbit, before we consider some of Francine Stock's points about wage settlements, what about the broader economic point that with the Chancellor now being seen to have got his budget forecast wrong on inflation as well as the balance of payments, isn't the opposition justified in talking about economic mismanagement?
No, I don't think so. On two grounds. First of all, the economy is not being mismanaged, and secondly, if it was, the opposition would be the last people to talk about it on the basis that they never managed to get it right for one day out of the whole of the time they were in office. The fact is that a lot of these problems do go back to last October and the stock market crash, when many people thought that crash would cause a recession, and there was a powerful argument that one had to allow extra liquidity into the economy. One had to let more money come into the economy to avoid getting pushed into a recession. Now, I think it may be a fair criticism that that was overdone, and that interest rates were a little on the low side at that time or soon afterwards.
Was it overdone also for the Chancellor to allow some £4 billion of extra spending into the economy in the form of tax cuts in his budget?
No, I don't think that was the case at all, because of course he has a very substantial budget surplus, and this is very different to the days that of the last Labour government, and indeed most of the post-war era, when Chancellors were running very substantial deficits on spending. Now, I don't think we want to necessarily increase very sharply the Chancellor's surplus.
What about the point then about the wage round now beginning and the prospects, as we heard in Francine Stock's report, of people over the year going on to settle at higher figures even than the 9% at which wages are running now?
Well, of course there'll be mugs if they do, and the employers will be mugs if they allow such settlements. I know very well of one particular engineering company whose attitude towards suppliers trying to pass higher prices on is, I'm sorry, we are not paying them. And if you try to push those sort of prices to us, we'll go overseas.
But is calling...
And of course that is why we've got a balance of payments problem. We've got an economy which is moving too fast. And we've got some employers who've been sloppy and are trying to push higher prices along the line. Well, they're going to meet some resistance.
But is calling people mugs enough of a government policy to stop such a dangerous development taking place?
No, I'm not a member of the government, and it's certainly not the government's policy to call people mugs. That's just what I'm saying is a thing that we ought to have learned by now, that if you overcharge for anything, including your own labour, sooner or later you lose your customers and you lose your job. And if we haven't learned that over the last 20 years, we've learned damn all. Now, the Chancellor's taken the right measures. He's increased interest rates. Now, that's going to take quite a good deal of purchasing power out of the economy. So we'll have a little less cash chasing the goods which are being produced. Now, the effect of that, as Peter Lilly was saying, is that we've had a sharp blip in the rate of inflation because we include mortgage rate in it.
But what if interest rates have to go up still further? If the rate of 12% isn't enough to encourage people to borrow less and save more, as the Prime Minister put it.
First of all, could we, before we hypothecate about that, take the view that just suppose mortgage rate stays where it is for 12 months. Now, in 12 months' time, this sharp increase will fall out of the index, and you'll get 0.75% coming off the index in a single month. Now that fall will be just about as artificial as this rise is artificial. What we need to be concerned about, as was suggested earlier in that film, is the underlying performance of the economy. And it does remind us that inflation is always a threat. And that should be a very powerful incentive to people to stand by this government, which understands that.
What the opposition has also been arguing today is that this shows the government now has an inflation problem as well as a balance of payments problem. Now, you mentioned that yourself. Isn't the difficulty here that both inflation and the cure, the government's cure of higher interest rates, make it still more difficult for our exporters to sell abroad and thus worsen the prospects for a bigger balance of payments deficit?
If indeed employers are finding the extra cost of borrowing money as a heavy burden, then the first thing they must do is to take a stiff line on their labour costs, because 1% on the rates at which they're borrowing money is a very small burden compared with an extra 1% on their wage bill. So they must really think very deeply about this, and so there's going to be an effect of those increased interest rates in making employers realise that they have to negotiate in a tough manner. Now, I'm not in favour of low wages, let me say that. And a lot of that increase in pay this year has come from increasing productivity. And that's an excellent thing. Where firms are successful, where productivity is increasing, it's only right that workers should get their share. And I'm one of those who rejoice in the fact that the chaps at British Steel are now being paid like Germans and producing steel like Germans. In fact, rather better.
Mr. Tebbit, thank you very much indeed. Within the next hour, Hurricane Gilbert is expected to cross the northern coast of Mexico. Already, its impact is being felt both there and across the border in Texas. There are reports of flood tides and tornadoes along the valley of the Rio Grande. The Texan coast is being battered too by winds of up to 80 miles an hour. Already, in its 2,000-mile journey across the Caribbean, the hurricane has left a trail of destruction in its wake, as well as claiming the lives of 58 people. In the Dominican Republic and neighboring Haiti, 16 people were killed. In Jamaica, where 1 in 5 are now homeless, the death toll was 12, while in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula yesterday, 17 people are known to have lost their lives before Gilbert turned north towards its destination this evening, 60 miles south of the American border and the town of Matamoros. The immediate area where the eye of the storm will hit is said to be lightly populated, but the full impact will also be felt further north, both in Mexico itself and across the border in Texas. There, as Chris Lowe now reports in London, the day has been spent preparing for the worst.
They were taking no chances. Thousands and thousands of people along the southern coast of Texas have been fleeing their homes and heading for higher ground. Many feared there would be nothing left when they returned.
I don't really expect to see my house when we get back to Corpus because we live right on the island.
Some took what precautions they could to protect their property, but if the full force of Hurricane Gilbert struck, it would be so much wasted effort. As the weather got worse, shopkeepers shut their doors. All their customers had gone. Television reporters on the scene coped as best they could in the gathering storm.
I am likely to be waist-high in water, and if I'm waist-high in water, it doesn't take a genius to tell you that the electronics are going to be underwater and we're going to be out of luck.
Brownsville, the southernmost city in Texas, has become a temporary home for hundreds of petrified Mexicans who crossed the border seeking refuge from a hurricane which continued to wreak havoc further south.
Are they frightened? ¿Tiene miedo?
Pues un poco. Sí, porque nunca pues ya pasado yo esto para acá.
She's a bit scared. She's very nervous about it because, again, this is her first hurricane experience.
But Brownsville, so near to the eye of the storm itself, was scarcely a safe place to be. Yet thousands couldn't flee because they couldn't afford the journey. Further north at Galveston, some stayed behind to watch, but more than half the population have taken the official advice and gone. This was the scene of the worst natural disaster in American history, when a hurricane killed 6,000 people in 1900. And there have been many hurricanes since.
We had a Category 3 storm here in 1983. It did about $400 million worth of damage. We had 120-mile-an-hour winds for 6 hours at night, and it was very, very frightening. And people have good memories, and they remember that. And this time, they're not going to stay here for a storm.
What's more, Hurricane Gilbert is of a different order altogether, the most powerful Atlantic hurricane on record. Already it has killed more than 50 people in 6 nations. And in Jamaica, the destruction has been devastating. Prime Minister Edward Seaga has declared much of the island a disaster area, and he described the events of the last few days as the worst catastrophe in modern Jamaican history. It was in the southern Caribbean last Saturday that the hurricane was born, and it's left hundreds of thousands of poor people homeless and caused billions of pounds worth of damage on its 2,000-mile rampage to the Gulf of Mexico. But sadly, hurricanes are all too frequent in this part of the world.
On average, there are between 4 and 10 hurricanes that hit the Caribbean each year. The 2 most severe hurricanes in recent years both occurred in 1979, Hurricane David and Hurricane Frederick, and those 2 hurricanes caused $2 or $3 billion worth of damage on the American coast, as well as killing something of the order of 2,000 people in the Dominican Republic.
The driving force behind a hurricane is evaporated water from seas which, in the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, are at their warmest at this time of year. The water vapor then condenses into clouds and rain. This process releases energy in the form of heat, and it's that energy which gives a hurricane its enormous power. Near the surface of the sea, warm air spirals into the eye of the storm. Just as water speeds up as it goes down the plug hole of a sink, so the air in a hurricane gradually spirals faster and faster. Only when it reaches land or a cold stretch of sea will the cycle of evaporation and condensation be broken and the hurricane subside. Gilbert has followed this classic pattern, but as meteorologists track its path across the Caribbean and Gulf of Mexico, their radar pictures have picked up another phenomenon, the double eye. Gilbert has apparently developed a secondary outer eye around the 8-mile-wide inner core. The radar cross-section shows clearly the center as a large trench, then intense winds and rain, and then the secondary eye. But this hurricane is different in other ways too.
Hurricane Gilbert has produced very strong winds at the core of the system, gusting up to 200 miles per hour. That is quite unusual, certainly the severest hurricane affecting the Caribbean for many decades. Also, the path of Hurricane Gilbert has been somewhat further west than average. Quite often, hurricanes recurve to the north and east before they reach the western part of the Gulf of Mexico. Hurricane Gilbert, having reached the Texan-Mexican border, has progressed further westward than is typical.
In the event, it may prove to be Mexico rather than the southern United States which takes the force of Hurricane Gilbert. It's not as powerful as it was when it struck Jamaica, but in the next few hours it's still capable of inflicting enormous damage wherever it goes.
Chris Lowe. Well, to track the latest progress of Hurricane Gilbert, our Washington correspondent Martin Bell has travelled down to the Texan coast. Just over an hour ago, I spoke to him on the seafront at Corpus Christi and asked him how far away the hurricane at that point was.
As we speak, it's about 70 miles off the coast, but it has this advanced surge. It sends its visiting card in advance, so what we're getting now is more than a sea breeze. What we're getting is the gusts of 30, 40 miles an hour, which of course are about a third of what we're going to get when the full force of Gilbert comes ashore.
When will that be?
We would expect about 7 o'clock our time, probably just about sort of 1 in the morning your time. I think the Texas-Mexico border is going to feel the full fury of it, but it's also going to be felt at least 100 miles both up the coast and down.
It almost looks, Martin, from the television picture at this moment as though things are getting worse by the moment, and yet there are still quite a lot of people about, it would appear.
Well, the Americans are wonderful and interesting people. Most of the people around here evacuated way inland a long while back. But there are the indefatigable sightseers who only get a hurricane of this size maybe every 6 or 7 years, and if it had been a 5, only once in a lifetime, and they want to see it. My guess is that in an hour or so, this boulevard here is going to be completely empty. left to the wind and the waves.
Because by that time it would be presumably dangerous for vehicles to be travelling along there.
Oh, absolutely. This is actually on a bay. You can imagine what it would be on the seafront. You get the waves breaking right over, and Texans in this part of the coast, they know what this kind of storm can do because they've had experience. A Force 3 hurricane in Galveston, just north of here, caused $400 million worth of damage. So they know what they're in for. But still, of course, they're fascinated, as we all are.
Martin, I hope you yourself are going to be able to take some cover before the night is out.
How very kind of you, thank you.
Our own indefatigable sightseer, Martin Bell. The Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, has proposed wide-ranging reductions in the Soviet presence in the Pacific if the United States agrees to match these cutbacks. In his first major speech after his 6-week holiday, Mr. Gorbachev said the Soviet fleet would pull out of the huge Cam Ranh Bay naval base in Vietnam if the United States withdrew from its military bases on the Philippines, the Subic Bay naval base and the massive Clark air base. Mr. Gorbachev also proposed that both superpowers freeze their deployment of nuclear weapons in the Pacific region, and he put forward a number of other concessions, including the conversion of the controversial radar complex at Krasnoyarsk in Siberia into an international space center. The United States claims these installations contravene the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, banning nationwide defenses against strategic missiles. Mr. Gorbachev made his proposals at Krasnoyarsk after a 5-day tour of Siberia. So far, the response from Washington has been cool, as David Tyndall now reports.
Mikhail Gorbachev is establishing quite a tradition of using his visits to Siberia to try to improve relations with his neighbors in the Far East. It started 2 years ago at Vladivostok, but today's speech was the most detailed so far. For the first time, he directly linked the future of the massive United States bases in the Philippines with the Soviet naval base in Vietnam, built at Cam Ranh Bay by the Americans 20 years ago. Mr. Gorbachev's proposal that the two superpowers pull out of their respective bases has long been called for by other nations in the region. But it's clearly not that simple.
Cam Ranh Bay base, although valuable, is much smaller than the two big bases in the Philippines and is much less valuable in terms of their relative strategies to the Russians than the Philippine bases are to the Soviets. Therefore, I see no reason to expect that the Americans will accept this deal.
Like the military bases, Mikhail Gorbachev's proposed conversion of the Krasnoyarsk radar complex is also seen as a non-starter. Washington has already said the idea appears unworkable. But behind Mr. Gorbachev's proposed package of measures lay a deeper purpose.
Well, the basic task is the Soviet Union has embarked, since the Vladivostok speech, on a series of initiatives in East Asia to improve the Soviet standing in the region, and it's hinged on improving relations with China. The big problem Gorbachev has faced is how to keep the process going, and he has to keep making these speeches and making changes in Soviet policy. This is the latest one, and it's clearly a very high-profile push to improve relations basically with the countries in Northeast Asia.
Mr. Gorbachev's main problem in the Soviet Far East, as was pressed home time and again in Siberia this week, was the desperate need for the region to catch up with the expanding capitalist economies of the Far East, as Dr. Martin Macaulay of London University discovered earlier this month.
The first thing that strikes you about Siberia is it's stunningly beautiful, but it's underdeveloped. Over the last 10 years, Siberia has gone asleep. Therefore, they need a lot of investment. They need infrastructure, housing, industry, agriculture. The area is quite fertile, there's black earth there, but the area is not in fact feeding itself.
Gorbachev has always claimed that there's huge potential for the Soviet Union in its Far East region. The difficulty is where to get the money to invest in the region and where to get the bodies to help build the area. China, in a sense, as the largest neighbor, can provide a lot of labor and cross-border trade and assistance of that sort. The other main aid will come from a country like Japan that has high technology and has got modern, sophisticated industrial goods, which the Soviets hope through such things as special economic zones they can build in the region and help expand very rapidly the Soviet economy in the region.
Improving relations with Peking was Mr. Gorbachev's first priority in the region. China repeatedly held off until certain conditions were first met, but the rapprochement between the two communist giants is now well underway, thanks to a number of concessions from Moscow.
First of all, they want the Vietnamese out of Kampuchea. They want Cam Ranh Bay to be closed down. They want the Soviet troops out of Mongolia. They want the Soviet troops thinned on the Sino-Soviet frontier and so on. They wanted the Soviets out of Afghanistan. They've got those things, or those things are being realized. The other thing is that the Chinese want the Soviets to respect them and to accord them equality with the Soviet Union.
But Mr. Gorbachev needs to attract massive investments to transform the moribund industries of the Soviet Far East, and that means Japan. That's why today, Mr. Gorbachev was careful to suggest ways of avoiding confrontation with the Soviet Union's immediate neighbors along the Pacific Rim.
Unlike previous Soviet initiatives which were aimed at China, this initiative is aimed at Japan, which can offer the Soviet Union a great amount of investment of high technology and an introduction of the Soviet Union into Pacific cooperation. The basic Gorbachev initiative is to satisfy the Japanese demand that the Soviet Union is peaceful and serious about maintaining stability in Northeast Asia and the Pacific as a whole.
Many nations of Southeast Asia would welcome the removal of the superpower navies from their Pacific waters, as proposed today by Mr. Gorbachev. But that day still looks far off. Mr. Gorbachev may have changed tack in his approach to the Americans here, but clearly his wider horizons are as much economic as military.
David Tyndall. In a few minutes, are they just a David Owen fan club, or are they still a viable political force? We assess the future for the Social Democrats on the eve of their first conference since the breakup of the alliance. But first, some of the day's other main news stories. The inquest into the deaths of 3 IRA terrorists in Gibraltar has been hearing evidence from members of a surveillance team who followed them before they were shot by the SAS. Those who witnessed their final steps say that as far as they could see, the terrorists did not try to surrender. Here's a report now from Neil Bennett.
Described in court only as the Watchers, surveillance teams were tracking the 3 terrorists through Gibraltar until the moment they were killed. The witness, referred to as Miss J, saw them standing together near the Shell garage on the road leading out of the colony. Sean Savage left the others and began walking back towards the town. Thinking she was the only one who had him under surveillance, she followed. Giving her evidence from behind a curtain to protect her identity, Miss J sounded like a young woman with a South of England accent. Her voice faltered occasionally as she spoke. I heard a police siren and the sound of gunfire behind me, she said. Savage turned round very quickly. He looked stunned. I've never heard gunfire before. I felt Savage knew in an instant before me what was happening. I turned away. I was very frightened. I felt Savage, possibly in terror, could strike out and trigger off a firing device or fire at people in the vicinity. To put it mildly, I was petrified. When she turned back, Savage was on the ground. Patrick McGrory, for the IRA members' families, suggested she turned away because she knew what would happen next, that Savage would be shot dead. That's not the case, she said. Another surveillance officer said he watched the terrorists looking at a car parked where the Royal Anglian Band assembled for their parade. It was suspected of containing their bomb. The officer said there were smiles on their faces. It was a chilling moment. I thought these were evil people, people who were prepared to spill blood.
The authorities in Poland and the outlawed trade union Solidarity have agreed to hold a series of talks on the future of Poland. The negotiations, which will start in October, are expected also to involve the church and a broad range of public and political figures. Lech Wałęsa, the Solidarity leader, said he was pleased at the way the talks had gone and warned that there was no chance for freedom in Poland without his union. Post office staff at 7 sorting offices around Britain are still on strike, but 75 offices are now in operation and there were deliveries today to most parts of the country. The post office says the backlog will take 2 weeks to clear and says it will give priority to first-class and international mail and to parcels. The Pope spent most of today in Swaziland, the penultimate stop on his troubled tour of southern Africa. His visit has been overshadowed by the hijack of a bus full of pilgrims in Lesotho, in which 6 people died. This evening, the Pope flew on to Mozambique, where he is due to stay 3 days. The American Space Agency has announced that the Space Shuttle Discovery will be launched on September the 29th. This will be the first launch of a shuttle since the ill-fated mission of the Challenger in 1986. President Jayawardeneh of Sri Lanka has announced he won't be standing in elections which should take place by the end of the year. Mr. Jayawardeneh, who's 82 tomorrow, has held the post of executive president for 10 years. The Olympic torch has reached Seoul at the end of its 3-week journey from Greece. The ceremony opening the Games is due to start in just over 2 hours. During the next 2 weeks, nearly 10,000 athletes from 160 countries will be competing for the much-coveted medals. Tomorrow, the SDP begins its 8th annual conference in Torquay. Social democratic spirits, still at a low ebb after the traumatic breakup of the alliance, will hardly have been lifted by an opinion poll in this morning's Guardian, giving the SDP just 3% of the vote, only a third of the figure for their SLD rivals. But the party clings on somehow to existence, represented by 3 MPs and 200 councillors around the country, and claiming 30,000 members. Our political correspondent, Nick Clark, has been examining what keeps Dr. Owen and his followers going.
For those who do not count themselves among the friends of the SDP, a field full of sheep on a hillside in Devon is a perfect image of the party. A passive flock following faithfully wherever the shepherd leads, until, inevitably, they end up in the political abattoir. The shepherd, of course, being Dr. David Owen.
I think what the SDP is going to be discussing over the weekend at its conference, I think, is very important.
The SDP, however, has grown accustomed to being written off, and the reality is that despite the general ghastliness of the past year, the party survives, and in places like Devon claims to thrive.
In Exeter, the actual council house rent.
Membership back near record levels, councillors holding the balance of power at county and district level, and defeatist talk decidedly off the agenda.
Now, I shall always be a member of the SDP. I don't mind how long I have to go on fighting for. I think the more we speak out and the more people hear us, the more people are going to support us. We are the answer for tomorrow.
Such enthusiasm in Devon and elsewhere made its mark on the party leader. Dr. Owen himself confessed recently how he wept as he witnessed the destruction of the old SDP last summer, and he admitted to Newsnight that he'd come close to throwing in the towel.
I don't think when I resigned as the leader, which I think I had no alternative but to do, I had any conception that we would be able to keep the SDP going. It was from the grassroots of the party that the demand came to retain the SDP, and gradually it built up. But if you ask John Cartwright or Rosie Barnes, even in early January, I don't think that the three of us were yet confident that we would be able to retain the SDP as a major party. It's the members who did it.
If it was the members who kept Dr. Owen in the game, the reverse must in many cases also be true. The SDP candidate in the Kensington by-election offered voters an unusually clear reminder of party identity. The official explanation was the need to avoid confusion, but many senior figures accept that things wouldn't have been the same if Dr. Owen hadn't been persuaded to take on the leader's mantle again.
Oh, I think without David Owen it would have been very difficult to continue the SDP. I think probably near impossible. I think that's fair to say. I think he's been crucial to it. In a sense, I'm perfectly content to describe the SDP as a David Owen fan club, in the sense that, of course, there are a lot of us who think he's made a tremendous contribution to British politics. But what it isn't is an organisation that simply consists of one person and a few supporters. It consists of a large number of people who hold a very important view about the future of British politics and the future of the country.
3 years ago, it looked as though the SDP's view of the future of the country might become very important very quickly. Then, as now, the party conference was held in Torquay.
We'll take our votes wherever people want to support us.
But while today the SDP languishes at just 3% in the polls, in 1985 the Alliance parties stood at 35%, ahead of both Labour and the Conservatives. David Owen talked of being in sight of outright victory. You could almost hear the frantic counting of unhatched chickens.
It was here in Cowley Street, just a stone's throw from the Palace of Westminster, that the SDP launched its original assault on the old two-party system. From here that famous by-election victories like that of Roy Jenkins at Hill Head and Shirley Williams at Crosby were planned. From here that the foundations of the Liberal SDP alliance were laid. Now, according to true SDP believers, number 4 Cowley Street has fallen into the hands of the enemy, a place where Dr. David Owen is no longer welcome.
I think one of the problems of the SDP was that we were such an immediate success, perhaps made us too impatient, too much of a hurry. It takes time to change the British political system. We're learning that the hard way, a very hard way.
Time, however, is not on the side of all concerned. Sir Leslie Murphy has been a key figure in the short history of the SDP. He was one of 2 trustees appointed to oversee the infant party's finances. He stayed on board when the alliance ship hit the rocks. He's still an SDP trustee. But now he's revealed to Newsnight that with such a long haul in prospect, he's ready to step down.
My wife says that I'm being stupid in trying to do so much as I now do. And I'm constantly under pressure for her to do rather less and spend more time here, which is really rather nice. And play a bit of golf, a bit more golf, instead of rushing around the country doing all sorts of things. And I think at my age, that's probably very sensible. So I've told David Owen that I cannot any longer be as active as I was in the past. And what they have to do is look for younger people who can carry this forward on a 10-year basis.
It must be disappointing, though, having got so far and having now taken so many steps apparently backwards.
Oh, I think it's extremely disappointing. Yes, of course. I mean, I think what happened last year is a tragedy. It's stupid. One was just powerless to stop it.
At least Sir Leslie remains a staunch supporter of Dr. Owen and all that he stands for. But nobody knows how many former SDP members have left to join the Democrats. And many of those once proudly billed as SDP celebrities, converts to a new political cause, have been driven from the political limelight altogether by the dramatic events of the past year. John Cleese, who made the SDP's party political broadcasts, has now withdrawn from active politics. Neither side has behaved very well, he added. Barry Cryer said he was very disillusioned about the breakup of the SDP. Bamber Gascoigne is disillusioned too and has given up active involvement in politics. Eric Porter said that after a brief, heady moment of euphoria, he had discovered that it was just the same old crap. David Putnam is now too busy with his new company even to think about the SDP. The actor Dennis Quilley is a rare exception.
I would love to see the SDP as some of us originally saw it and read it, could still have some resurgence of life in it. Owen, for good or ill, seems to have stuck to his guns, which is something I admire enormously. I mean, at the probable cost to himself of years in the political wilderness, who knows, but somehow I do feel that he has hung on to the original conception more faithfully than the other branch.
Before long, in the bracing air of North Yorkshire, the personal beliefs and commitment of SDP survivors will be subjected to their sternest public tests so far. The constituency of Richmond faces a by-election in the new year. It's an area where the SDP has strong local council representation and a good organisational base. It's also just the sort of traditional Tory seat which in the past has proved vulnerable to attack from the centre. But with the centre parties in disarray, this by-election will be different.
It's ridiculous and tragic. We've always made it plain in the SDP that we're prepared to work with like-minded people in any other party, not just in the Liberal Party. We've worked very well together as an alliance group at County Council, better than I ever dreamt possible, really. And I think it's quite silly that we are fighting one another now at a parliamentary by-election.
The SDP view is that it must fight a seat like Richmond, or there's no point in going on. The view of the Democrats is that to allow the SDP a free hand anywhere would be to give credibility to a party which it wishes to see exterminated as rapidly as possible.
But there's a lot more power in the centre if only it can regain its self-confidence, if only it can regain its coherence. But as long as we fight each other, kick each other in the teeth, shoot each other in the foot, you won't do very well.
He has so damaged relationships between the two parties that I think any chance of any future cooperation is nil. And indeed, the whole point of bringing the merger about was to stop the nonsense of having parties working together and having two leaders and two organizations and two of everything. And we would completely defeat that objective if we once again started going to coalitions and alliances before a general election. So I don't think there's a cat in hell's chance of that coming about.
Which does not mean that SDP councillors like Harold Luscombe are without friends. They may be vilified by the Democrats and disdained by the bigger parties, but a few of them are still exercising real political clout. Mr. Luscombe leads the SDP group on Devon County Council, without which the Conservatives cannot raise a majority. The position is much the same on Exeter City Council, where Jill Palmer is one of two SDP councillors who hold the balance of power on several important committees. It's in such alliances, locally, and perhaps one day nationally, that the party places its faith. Dr. Owen says no coalitions are ruled out, provided, of course, that Labour one day changes its defence policy.
There is a basic instinct, I think, that says, I support a British nuclear deterrent, but I also support the health service. I support a market economy, but I also support the state educational system. There's a basic instinct in this country for all four of those policies. They're only reflected unequivocally in the SDP. Sometime, someday, I believe it will come through and it will be the party of the future. And as long as I believe that, and as long as thousands of other members believe it, we've got a chance.
Dr. Owen accepts that for the time being, survival is the name of the game. But perhaps even he can't tell how long that will remain a sufficient motive for the existence of the SDP. And one of the main purposes of the party assembly will be for the faithful to reassure each other that things could hardly get any worse.
Nick Clark reporting. And briefly now, back to Hurricane Gilbert. A little earlier, we heard from Martin Bell in Corpus Christi in southern Texas. I understand Martin has now moved into the relative safety and comfort of his hotel room, from where I hope he joins us now. Martin, what is happening?
What's happened is that about half an hour ago, the eye of the storm came ashore about 100 miles south of the border. The good news is that it came ashore in a part of northern Mexico, which is relatively sparsely populated. The not so good news is there's some very wild winds blowing around, both north and south of the border, up here in Corpus Christi. It's been difficult at one time to see even more than about 100 yards. It was a great wall of horizontally driving rain. And the full effects, any damage caused by these winds, we're not actually going to know until the storm has blown itself out, till sometime tomorrow morning.
Is it possible that as the storm proceeds northwards towards where you are, some of its force will be dissipated?
Oh, absolutely. It is going to cease to be a force 3 hurricane within a matter of hours. It'll come down to a tropical storm and gradually disperse. And I think looking back, it will have seemed to have been the storm of the century in Jamaica and the Yucatan Peninsula. But here on the Texas coast, why just another of those seasonal hurricanes?
You were talking earlier, Martin, about the Americans being indefatigable sightseers. Are there still many or any people about out there?
Not a soul, not a single soul. They're not stupid, and they saw the way things were going, and they left that seawall and they've gone back home.
Martin, thanks once again for joining us at the end of the programme. Thank you and good night. Well, turning now to tomorrow morning's front pages, you'll find some coverage, as you'd expect, of the hurricane. The Guardian has the picture of the ship beached in Mexico. The Guardian leads with interest rates pushing inflation up to 5.7%. The Times concentrates, as we did earlier, on the pay rise fears as inflation leaps. Also that ship in Mexico stranded. The Daily Express leads on the MI5 girls who were involved in the surveillance of the IRA gang. Also mention of the hurricane. Today leads on a British heiress who apparently has been eaten alive by lions in Africa. The Daily Star leads on a boy mugged for his dog. Well, that's all from Newsnight for tonight. Join us again on Monday if you can at 10:40. Till then, from all of us on the programme, have a very good weekend and good night.